This video is brought to you by Ground News. For most of the past couple of years, Russia's currency, the ruble, has been on the decline. However, to the surprise of many, the first 4 months of 2025 have turned out to be one of the best periods for the Russian currency in recent years. After completely crashing late last year, the Russian ruble has been steadily strengthening, and in the past month has surged against the dollar, rising to its highest level since mid-2023, and making it the best performing currency in the world. So in this video, we're going to have a look at the ruble's recent surge, what's driving it, and what it means for the Kremlin. Who's the best politician right now? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. Let's start with a quick recap. Despite a sharp decline in the immediate aftermath of Putin's invasion, the ruble quickly recovered and reached a post-war peak and 7-year high of 50 to the dollar in June 2022. However, since then, the ruble has been declining. It fell steadily over the following year, stabilising at about 90 rubles to the dollar at the beginning of 2024. Then, towards the end of last year, it resumed its decline, going from 85 rubles to the dollar in early August to a new low of 108 in late November, with the ruble ending the year with its worst performance since 2022. There were at least 3 key reasons behind this decline. First, the escalation of secondary sanctions throughout last year, like the sanctioning of Gazprom Bank, which had been the last major non-sanctioned bank in Russia, which limited Russian companies' access to foreign currency. Second, a dramatic increase in the money supply within Russia, largely as a consequence of the Kremlin's increase in military spending. This hasn't been matched by an equivalent increase in economic output or demand, and a greater supply of rubles without an equivalent increase in demand will, all else being equal, result in a weaker ruble. And third, an increase in inflation domestically has encouraged Russians to shift their cash abroad, to avoid inflation eating away at the value of their ruble deposits. This effectively involves Russians selling their rubles for foreign currency, putting further downwards pressure on the currency. However, according to recent data compiled by Bloomberg, in the past few months, this trend has reversed, and the Russian ruble has been surging, strengthening by 38% against the dollar on the over-the-counter market since the beginning of this year. This means the ruble has outperformed even the traditional safe haven of gold, which has climbed 23% in the same time frame to an all-time high of $3,500 an ounce. So, what explains this surge? Well, the first thing to note is that here we're comparing the ruble's value against the dollar, and at least some of this apparent surge is actually a consequence of the dollar's depreciation, rather than the ruble's appreciation. As you might already know, Trump's unorthodox and erratic economic policies have undermined the dollar's reputation as a safe asset, which is why the American stock market has been falling at the same time as both the dollar and US treasuries. Usually, when the stock market falls, the dollar and US treasuries go up, because investors are moving out of riskier assets in the stock market, into nominally safe assets like the dollar and US treasuries. The fact that all three fell together earlier this week is proof that investors are actually just pulling their cash out of America altogether, and no longer see the dollar as a safe asset, or at least not as safe as it was. According to the dollar index, which measures the value of the dollar against a weighted basket of other currencies, the dollar is now down 10% from its January peak. Nonetheless, this doesn't totally explain the ruble's recent rise. After all, the ruble has risen by more than 10% against the dollar, and is up against even well-performing currencies like the euro. So, what's driving the ruble's appreciation here? Well, some of this is a consequence of the super tight monetary policy pursued by Russia's central bank. To bring down inflation, which has been rising since late 2023 and is now running at more than 10% year on year, the Russian central bank has raised rates to an eye-watering 21%. This has made it attractive to save in rubles, increasing demand for rubles and deterring Russians from stashing their cash abroad. Simultaneously, the Kremlin has tightened its fiscal policy, mainly by cutting certain subsidies and raising taxes, including corporate income tax, which has reduced the supply of rubles and helped its appreciation. Similarly, Russian exporters are still required to sell around a quarter of their foreign currency earnings on the local market, which continues to buttress the currency. However, it looks like most of this appreciation has been driven by Trump's recent overtures to Moscow. Even if Trump doesn't succeed in getting Russia and Ukraine to agree to a ceasefire, he's talked up the prospect of economic normalization with Russia, and Russia, along with North Korea and Belarus, was conspicuously excluded from his recent bout of tariffs. In fact, according to a recent report by Axios, Trump's so-called peace plan explicitly includes the lifting of sanctions on Russia and deeper economic cooperation between Russia and the US, especially in the energy and industrial sectors. This could be achieved by the US unilaterally, i.e. without Ukrainian consent, which is why there's a widespread suspicion that Trump plans to go ahead with them anyway. This has, in turn, given foreign investors hope for a possible easing of US sanctions, increasing interest in the ruble and ruble assets. So, what does this actually mean for the Kremlin? Well, to be honest, it's pretty good news. The ruble's appreciation reflects renewed optimism about Russia's economic prospects and could help ease Russia's escalating inflationary crisis by making imports cheaper. This would be very welcome from the Kremlin's perspective. As we mentioned a second ago, inflation is still rising in Russia, despite some super steep interest rate hikes by the central bank. But according to the central bank, inflation has already started to slow as a result, and Russians have reportedly started booking holidays abroad at more affordable prices. Nonetheless, the ruble's newfound strength presents a bit of a problem for Russia's budget, because the ruble's appreciation will actually make Russia's oil exports less competitive. Oil exports are currently Russia's primary source of hard currency, and, along with gas revenues, account for about 35% of the federal budget. This comes on top of a pre-existing problem for the Kremlin, plummeting global oil prices. For context, since the pandemic, oil prices have been quite high, and while sanctions after Russia's invasion of Ukraine meant Russia had to sell at a discount, global prices were still high enough for the Kremlin to rake in serious cash. However, since Trump's Liberation Day, oil prices have crashed, largely because traders expect a slowdown in global growth to hurt oil demand, which has dampened Russian oil revenues. Nonetheless, in the aggregate, the ruble's recent appreciation is good news for Russia, and the big question for both Russia and Ukraine is whether it can last. Whether the ruble appreciation continues will partly depend on whether a ceasefire will materialise, but Zelensky has recently rejected Trump's ceasefire proposal that includes the recognition of Crimea as part of Russia. This story has been reported on by more than 350 sources. Interestingly, we can see that of those, 32% came from left-leaning outlets, while 22% came from outlets that lean right. Looking at the headlines, you can also see some differences, with left-leaning outlets framing Trump's criticism of Zelensky as an aggressive attack, accusing him of making inflammatory statements, while right-leaning sources highlighted Trump pressing Zelensky for a peace deal, reflecting different views on the conflict's resolution. We're able to do that because of our sponsor Ground News, whose incredible website and app lets you discover the news and pulls back the curtain on media bias. Built by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news, with Ground News ingesting over 50,000 articles from all over the world, and then organising each by story. For each and every story, you can see the number of reporting sources, where these sources lean on the political spectrum at an individual level and group level, compare the headlines of each source, and read each article all without ever leaving the app. But one of the best parts of the app is their blind spot feed. It presents you with stories and articles that haven't been reported on by one side of the aisle or the other, helping you better break out of your media bubble and discover what those on the other side of the political spectrum are really saying. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I think an app like this will only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. If you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the unlimited Access Vantage plan using the link in the description or by scanning the QR code. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.